This is the DEFCON Warning System. Alert status for 1 p.m. Universal Time Coordinated, Monday, the 12th of January 2026. Condition green, DEFCON 5. There are currently no imminent nuclear threats at this time. In an emergency session at the United Nations Security Council this week, the United States delivered a blunt message to rivals. The Western Hemisphere is off-limits to hostile powers. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Michael Waltz defended the recent U.S. operation in Venezuela, which saw American special forces capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, as a necessary act of self-defense against a regime he labeled an illegitimate narco-terrorist. Waltz stated, "This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries, competitors, and rivals." The U.S. accuses Maduro of turning Venezuela into a hub for Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Hezbollah militants, and drug cartels that harm U.S. interests. Washington underscored that the days of American restraint in its backyard are over, vowing to use every tool to eradicate these threats in the region. This muscular doctrine, echoing a 21st century Monroe Doctrine, drew outrage from Venezuela's allies. Russia and China condemned the U.S. raid as a blatant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and international law. They argued that abducting a sitting, if disputed, head of state sets a dangerous precedent. The U.S., however, insists Maduro was not a legitimate president and frames the operation as a one-time, surgical law enforcement action targeting an indicted drug trafficker, not an act of war against Venezuela. Washington cited self-defense provisions of the UN Charter to justify its actions, claiming Venezuela, under Maduro, had effectively become a forward base for hostile actors attacking the U.S. via drug flows and proxy forces. Latin American reactions are mixed. Some countries quietly welcome the removal of Maduro, while others fear the precedent of armed intervention. The episode has significantly raised tensions between the U.S. and the Russia-China bloc, as Moscow and Beijing view the Venezuela raid as evidence of aggressive U.S. imperial behavior. The Western Hemisphere warning serves notice to those powers not to expand their influence in Latin America, a stance that will likely heighten East-West friction going forward. The United States has dramatically escalated its campaign to acquire Greenland, the strategic Arctic territory of Denmark. This week, the United States says it considers Greenland's acquisition a national security priority and pointedly warned that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option to achieve that goal. Washington argues that controlling Greenland is vital to deter China and Russia in the Arctic and to secure valuable rare earth minerals. This tough talk, essentially threatening a NATO ally with force, has sent shockwaves through Europe and Canada. In an unusual display of unity, the leaders of Denmark, Greenland, and multiple major European states, including France, Germany, and the UK, issued a joint statement reaffirming that Greenland belongs to its people and that only Denmark and Greenland can decide its status. They flatly rejected threats, pressure, and talk of annexation. Canada's Prime Minister also offered support, dispatching high-level envoys to Greenland and affirming that the island's sovereignty must be respected. Despite near-universal rebuke from allies, the U.S. appears undeterred. The president first floated buying Greenland back in 2019, and now emboldened by recent U.S. assertiveness elsewhere, he has revived the idea with vigor. The U.S. claims Denmark is failing to protect Greenland from growing Russian and Chinese presence, a claim Denmark vehemently denies, and insists American control of Greenland is essential for U.S. security. The White House has even appointed a special envoy for Greenland, who provocatively said he has little interest in talking with Danish officials and intends to pitch the idea of U.S. affiliation directly to Greenlanders, dangling promises of investment and a better life. European capitals view this as a brazen attempt to undermine Danish sovereignty. NATO's cohesion is being tested. leaders warned that an American move on Greenland would shatter the alliance's credibility. Poland's prime minister bluntly noted that no NATO member should ever threaten another, otherwise, NATO would lose its meaning. Even within Washington, there is resistance. Congress members from both parties have urged the president to honor treaty obligations and not upend the post-WWII principle that national borders aren't changed by force. Military analysts add that trying to seize Greenland would be catastrophic for America's alliances and global standing, fundamentally altering U.S. foreign policy towards a raw, might-makes-right approach. For now, the situation remains a war of words. U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have reportedly told lawmakers that no invasion is imminent and that the fiery rhetoric is meant to pressure Denmark into negotiations. Nevertheless, Europe is on edge. NATO's Secretary-General has privately expressed alarm, and some allies are even considering bolstering their presence in the Arctic to signal support for Denmark. The Greenland showdown has opened an unprecedented rift between the US and its longtime allies, injecting new uncertainty into Western unity. Another striking development is the United States' announcement that the US military will begin conducting land strikes against drug cartels inside Mexico. In a televised interview, the US president lamented the scourge of fentanyl and other drugs, claiming cartels are running Mexico and are responsible for 250,000 to 300,000 American deaths a year, a figure far above official estimates. To combat this, he stated, "We are going to start hitting the land targets, implying cross-border raids, or strikes on cartel compounds, labs, or leadership on Mexican soil." This marks a significant escalation from the past months, when U.S. forces only targeted drug smuggling boats at sea and a few facilities in South America. If implemented, it would be the first time the U.S. conducts regular military attacks inside the territory of its ally Mexico without invitation, raising major legal and geopolitical concerns. Mexican leaders reacted with outrage and alarm. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who only recently took office in Mexico City, firmly opposes any U.S. military incursion. She warned that any unauthorized strike would violate Mexico's sovereignty and could cause dangerous fallout. Sheinbaum has even proposed constitutional changes to ban foreign military actions in Mexico, reinforcing that the Americas do not belong to any single nation, a pointed rebuke of Washington's hemispheric dominance rhetoric. Observers note that Mexico's cooperation is vital. Unilateral U.S. action could collapse bilateral security ties and spark nationalist backlash in Mexico. Even U.S. defense officials are reportedly wary that armed intervention could backfire. It might fragment the cartels, trigger wider violence, and push desperate refugees toward the U.S. border. There's also the uncomfortable precedent of attacking a friendly country, something that could strain U.S. relations across Latin America. From an international perspective, the U.S. stance underscores a pattern. The U.S. is increasingly willing to use military force beyond its borders, even outside traditional war contexts. While drug cartels are not states, other nations are watching this decision closely. U.S. rivals may interpret the green light for cross-border strikes as evidence that Washington is more unrestrained and unpredictable, potentially heightening their own threat perceptions. Already, North Korea cited U.S. operations in places like Venezuela as justification for its latest missile tests. More on that later. For now, the United States has not given details on when these cartel strikes might start, or how broad they would be. But the mere declaration has set off intense debates in Washington and Mexico. Legal experts question if the president has authority to launch attacks in Mexico without Congress, and whether cartel targets would be distinguishable enough to avoid civilian casualties or clashes with Mexican forces. This unprecedented move against a neighbor and ally will remain a key flashpoint to monitor. It does not directly involve nuclear weapons, but it speaks to a climate of increased military assertiveness that can influence how other conflicts evolve. In a development sowing further transatlantic tension, the United States publicly cast doubt on whether NATO would come to America's aid if the US were ever attacked. On his Truth Social account, Mr. Trump wrote, "Russia and China have zero fear of NATO without the United States, and I doubt NATO would be there for us if we really needed them." This startling statement from a US president, essentially questioning the mutual defense bedrock of the alliance, sent Western diplomats scrambling for clarification. Shortly after, the White House press secretary insisted that US commitment to NATO remains ironclad, pointing out that Mr. Trump also said, "We will always be there for NATO, even if they won't be there for us." According to the administration, this was meant to underscore that Washington will uphold Article 5 obligations regardless of reciprocity. But many in Europe heard it as a stinging criticism, an American leader suggesting allies are freeloaders who might abandon the US in a crisis. The timing could not be more sensitive. This week the US is already at odds with European allies over Greenland and other issues. Now, allies are quietly alarmed that the US president's faith in NATO's collective defense is wavering. Security analysts note that such doubts, voiced from the Oval Office, undermine deterrence. Adversaries like the Kremlin might perceive division or hesitancy in the alliance, potentially emboldening them. Indeed, Russia has long aimed to fracture NATO unity. Comments like these unfortunately play into that narrative. On the other hand, some US officials argue Trump's remark is intended to jolt Europe into greater self-reliance, much as his past pressure led NATO members to increase their defense spending. In fact, Mr. Trump took credit again this week for allies raising their military budgets, claiming he got NATO countries to aim for 5% of GDP on defense, up from the long-standing 2% target. European leaders acknowledge US pressure has had an effect, but they bristle at suggestions they wouldn't fight alongside America. Notably, no NATO ally has signaled any intent to shirk Article 5 if the US were attacked. If anything, Europe fears the opposite scenario, that the US might not honor Article 5 if they are attacked, given Mr. Trump's past ambivalence about the alliance's value. In summary, this episode adds to stress on the NATO alliance's cohesion. For now, NATO's Secretary-General and key European presidents are emphasizing unity in public and downplaying the comment. But privately, there is concern and confusion. The DEFCON Warning System will be watching whether these transatlantic rifts widen, as alliance unity, or lack thereof, has direct implications for global nuclear stability and adversaries' calculations. Moscow has dramatically upped the ante in the Ukraine war's nuclear shadow play. On January 9th, Russia launched a powerful nuclear-capable ballistic missile into western Ukraine, striking an area alarmingly close to the Polish border. The weapon, identified as an Oreshnik, intermediate-range hypersonic missile, is designed to carry nuclear warheads across continental distances. In this case, it was apparently armed with a dummy, inert payload and broke apart into submunitions, causing only limited damage near the city of Lviv. However, the significance was not lost on anyone. This is only the second time Russia has fired an Oreshnik missile in combat, and the first time ever near a NATO frontier. The Kremlin appears to be sending a deliberate signal to the West, demonstrating its willingness to brandish a nuclear-capable system as a warning. Ukrainian and European officials reacted with alarm. Ukraine's foreign minister called the strike the grave threat to European security, noting it was demonstratively close to EU and NATO territory. President Zelensky warned neighboring countries that if Russia is willing to use medium-range ballistic missiles in Ukraine, this is the same challenge for Warsaw, for Bucharest, for Budapest, essentially urging Europe to recognize the shared danger. The European Union's foreign policy chief condemned Russia's action as a clear escalation intended to intimidate Europe and the United States. Western capitals vowed not to be cowed. officials from the EU and NATO said this underscores the need to bolster Ukraine's air defenses and maintain pressure on Moscow. Berlin and Paris issued statements that threatening such missile strikes will not break our resolve in supporting Ukraine. At the same time, NATO militaries quietly reviewed their alert status, though there's been no public shift of NATO's nuclear posture in response to this single strike. From Moscow's perspective, the launch served multiple purposes. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed the Oreshnik strike was retaliation for a supposed Ukrainian drone attack on one of President Putin's residences, an incident that US and Ukrainian sources say never actually happened. This dubious pretext suggests the strike was pre-planned as a show of strength. It also coincided with a sensitive moment. Peace talks were taking place in Paris aimed at ending the war. By using a nuclear-capable missile during negotiations, Putin may be leveraging nuclear fear to gain advantage at the bargaining table, essentially reminding everyone that Russia can dramatically escalate if it doesn't get acceptable terms. Moreover, the strike followed a week of setbacks and frustrations for Moscow internationally, most notably the US operation in Venezuela that ousted Putin's ally Maduro. Some analysts believe Putin wanted to respond to that geopolitical setback by flexing Russia's strategic muscle elsewhere. Importantly, there is no indication that this missile carried an actual nuclear warhead. The use of a dummy warhead suggests Russia wanted a provocative demonstration without crossing the ultimate red line of a nuclear detonation. Even so, the psychological impact is significant. Russia has also forward-deployed some of these Oreshnik IRBMs to Belarus, bringing much of Eastern Europe within range. By employing one in Ukraine, the Kremlin is essentially normalizing the presence of nuclear-capable weapons in active use. This behavior erodes the traditional firebreak between conventional and nuclear forces. It keeps the world on edge that a miscalculation, or further escalation, could one day slip into nuclear use, intentional or not. For now, Western officials have labeled it nuclear saber-rattling dangerous, but still a rung below direct nuclear confrontation. The DEFCON Warning System continues to monitor these signals closely. Russia's calculated risk in using such a missile did not prompt any immediate counter-escalation from NATO, but it has raised the overall alertness regarding Moscow's next moves. Iran is in the throes of its most significant internal unrest in decades, sparking concern given the country's suspected nuclear weapons ambitions. For over 2 weeks now, mass protests have swept Iran's cities, as people take to the streets over soaring prices, economic mismanagement, and anger at the authoritarian regime. What began in late December as demonstrations against a sudden currency collapse has transformed into open calls for the end of clerical rule. Faced with this challenge, the Iranian government's response has been brutal. Security forces and militia units cracked down hard, and by some credible reports hundreds of protesters have been killed in just days. An Iranian human rights group estimates roughly 500 civilian deaths and tens of thousands arrested. The regime imposed an internet blackout to prevent protesters from organizing and videos from getting out, but glimpses have emerged of large crowds chanting against Supreme Leader Khamenei despite live gunfire and heavy police presence. This domestic upheaval is noteworthy to nuclear risk watchers because Iran is a threshold nuclear state with a history of clandestine atomic work. Western intelligence believes that Tehran has been actively pursuing nuclear weapons capability, even as it insists its program is peaceful. Some analysts even suspect Iran may have assembled 1 or 2 crude nuclear devices in secret, possibly not fully weaponized or tested, but as a hedge or for research purposes. There is no confirmation of an actual deployable bomb, but Iran's rapid enrichment of uranium in recent years means it is perilously close to the bomb's doorstep. A destabilized Iran raises multiple red flags. Could a desperate regime take drastic steps, like rushing to build a bomb, or even using one, to survive? Could nuclear materials or knowledge slip out amidst chaos? If hardline elements feel cornered, they might also provoke an external crisis, for instance, by attacking US forces or Israel to rally nationalist support at home. So far, Iran's embattled leadership is blaming foreign enemies for the unrest. State TV and officials claim the protests are a Western and Israeli conspiracy, a narrative intended to justify harsh measures. Ironically, this comes after Iran itself was struck last year. In June 2025, the United States and Israel carried out a joint 12-day military campaign that bombed Iran's key nuclear sites, aiming to halt what they saw as an imminent nuclear weapons breakout. Those strikes dealt serious damage to Iranian facilities and military assets. In response, Iran's regime clamped down internally, arrested thousands, accusing them of spying or disloyalty, and accelerated executions of dissidents in 2025. Now, with fresh protests, the government again sees a hidden foreign hand. Whether or not foreign intelligence is stoking the unrest, it's clear that Iran's domestic stability is fraying under economic strain and public fury. From a strategic standpoint, Iran's turmoil presents a double-edged situation. On one hand, a weakening of the current regime could slow or complicate its nuclear program, especially if resources are diverted to internal control, or if the leadership loses coherence. There is even the outside possibility of a more moderate, or at least differently oriented government emerging if the protests somehow led to political change. On the other hand, history shows that regimes under existential threat can become more dangerous in the short term. Iran might choose to escalate its nuclear work as a form of insurance, or lash out at regional adversaries to change the subject. Neighboring Israel is especially on alert. Israeli officials have hinted that Iran's regime might attack abroad, for example, via proxy militias or missile strikes, to externalize the crisis. The Middle East region is tense, watching whether Iran's unrest will fizzle out or explode into something bigger. The DEFCON Warning System is a private intelligence organization which has monitored and assessed nuclear threats by national entities since 1984. It is not affiliated with any government agency and does not represent the alert status of any military branch. The public should make their own evaluations and not rely on the DEFCON Warning System for any strategic planning. At all times, citizens are urged to learn what steps to take in the event of a nuclear attack. If this had been an actual attack, the DEFCON Warning System will give radiation readings for areas that are reported to it. Your readings will vary. Official news sources will have radiation readings for your area. For immediate updates, visit www.defconwarningsystem.com. Breaking news and important information can be found on the DEFCON Warning System Community Forum and on the DEFCON Twitter feed DEFCON WS Alerts. You may also subscribe to the DEFCON Warning System mailing list. Note that Twitter updates may be subject to delays. The next scheduled update is 1 p.m., the 19th of January 2026. Additional updates will be made as the situation warrants, with more frequent updates at higher alert levels. This concludes this report of the DEFCON Warning System.